Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the US of A. It's election time and it'll all be about the economy. We've got one eye on the present and this week's warnings from the top US economic policymaker Janet Yellen and the future direction the country will take under whoever wins the White House in November. Also this week, Finland, the country that used to be one of the EU's most prosperous, now it's second only to Greece on the worst performing scale. And questions are being asked if it should actually leave the Eurozone and devalue its currency. And in Brazil, they say the year doesn't truly begin until after Carnival, but are its economic woes reigning on the big parade? So we're officially up and running in the United States presidential race, the first Republican and Democrat primary, the first concrete indication of what voters are thinking. And so a good time for us to look at the US economy and where it might be headed. I don't need to remind you, even in these times when we're all concerned about the likes of China, that the strength of the US economy is critical to the whole world. So we watched Janet Yellen closely this week, the head of the US Federal Reserve, who gave what's known as her semi-annual monetary policy report to Congress. Now, remember, Yellen took the plunge this year and finally increased US interest rates for the first time in nearly a decade. But was it possibly too soon? Still, in her testimony, we were looking to see if she could allay the growing fears about another economic downturn.
Financial conditions in the United States have recently become less supportive of growth, with declines in broad measures of equity prices, higher borrowing rates for riskier borrowers, and a further appreciation of the dollar. These developments, if they prove persistent, could weigh on the outlook for economic activity in the labor market. Still, ongoing employment gains and faster wage growth should support the growth of real incomes and therefore consumer spending.
Now, if the economy is ailing, people tend to vote against the party in the White House. There is a simple logic to that. But it's worth reminding ourselves of what state the US economy is in now compared with when this current administration came in back in 2009. On the jobs front, which is really the most important one, unemployment has gone down from 7.8% in January 2009 to 4.9% now. And you know, it was as high as 10% in October of 2009. GDP growth, well, it's still not brilliant, but look at the turnaround. Negative 2.8% growth in 2009, 2.4% in the black last year. There's only one place, though, there's been almost no movement. That is with interest rates. They were 0.25% back then. They are 0.5% now, and that tiny increase, as we mentioned, has only just happened. So perhaps what we query is whether 7 years of such low interest rates has really yielded the growth it should have. But don't forget the words of James Carville, Bill Clinton's campaign strategist back in 1992, when he said, quite simply, "It's the economy, stupid." In other words, that is what decides elections. We're going to talk to our guest about this now. Russell Jones joining us from London. He is a macroeconomist and partner at Llewellyn Consulting, an independent economics advisory firm. Russell, we have already pointed out that it is not uncommon to vote against the White House when the economy is not doing so well. Would that be a fair assessment at the moment? Because as we've just illustrated, this Obama administration is kind of doing all right, given the precarious position it came from.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing at the moment is not just a US phenomenon, you're seeing something of a global phenomenon where incumbent parties of government are increasingly unpopular. There is a sense of frustration amongst electorates all over the world, a polarization of electorates. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the United States at the moment. And I think that does reflect the fact that this economic recovery has been so hesitant and so uneven. It may have been, or may be quite long in the tooth now. I mean, we're 7 years into an upswing, but it hasn't really felt terribly rewarding to a lot of people. They don't feel that their incomes have been expanding at the rate that they saw before the crisis. And generally there's a sense of disquiet, a sense of angst, a sense of uncertainty which is prevailing.
Is your feeling, though, that at least the US is on the right track? Obviously, interest rates went up. It was only a small move, I'll grant you that. But based on that and based on what Janet Yellen has been saying, does it look to be in the last year of this administration that the US is on the right track at least?
I think in relative terms, the United States economy is performing pretty well, and I think most policymakers in Washington would be grateful that they're not sitting in Frankfurt or Berlin or Tokyo or in some of the capitals of the emerging market world at the moment. But by the standards of previous cyclical upswings, previous recoveries, this is a pretty shallow one. But the bottom line is I think the US is doing better than most. The Federal Reserve, as you suggested, has started to try and normalize monetary policy. That may be a process which, at least temporarily, is drawn to a halt. The Federal Reserve, I think, will certainly be soft pedaling on official interest rate increases. They don't want to move very quickly. It's a very uncertain environment. And I'd be surprised, for example, were official interest rates in the US to rise by very much this year. But in the great scheme of things, I think the US is doing better than most.
I just feel, Russell, that it has the potential to be a very peculiar year in the United States because you've got this Obama administration which still needs to do its job and stick to its guns until January. But we'll also be thinking about, well, what could the White House look like next year under Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump?
The answer to the last part of that question is goodness only knows. I think under Hillary Clinton, you'd probably find that the US economy is run in a very similar fashion to the way it's been run under Barack Obama. If there's a Republican in the White House, and certainly if it's Donald Trump, I think all bets are off. I mean, it's extremely hard to know precisely how policy will play out. Trump has a very interventionist bent and a very protectionist bent. And both of those trends would go very much against the grain of what we've become used to in the United States. It would be a very uncertain environment, and I think that uncertainty would be reflected in some very volatile financial markets, for example.
So then what are you expecting from the rest of this year? I know you've already mentioned that you don't expect interest rates to move at any great speed, but what should we be keeping our eye on in the US economy? We concentrate so much about other economies these days, the emerging markets and China, but still, and I've said this already, what happens in the US is so important for the whole world.
I think the bottom line is probably that the US economy behaves this year much as it has done in the last couple of years. So we have an expansion rate probably in the region of 2% per annum. Not great, but probably better than most of its competitors. But having said that, the risks around that prediction, I think, are unusually large at the moment. And, the global economy has so many fault lines at the moment. We could mention China, we could mention the other BRICS, we could mention the weakness of commodity prices in general, fragilities in banking sectors, and just the sense that we're still recovering or healing from that huge crisis we suffered 7 or 8 years ago. So it's a brave new world, really, and the United States can't escape that, and US policymakers can't escape that. I think they have to be very sensitive to the way that the data plays out. They have to be very sensitive to those risks that I mentioned. It is a very uncertain environment for economists and a very uncertain environment for people making monetary and fiscal policy in Washington at the moment.
It'll be interesting, won't it? Russell Jones talking US economy with us. Pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what about foreign investment in the United States? How much of a revenue stream could that be for the economy? Well, we're going to tell you about an interesting scheme now which does bring in ad hoc chunks of cash, but it has a purpose far beyond that, and it hinges on the act of essentially buying a visa legally to live in the United States. It is a little-known visa called the EB-5, or more commonly the Investor Green Card. It was the result of the 1990 Immigration Act. And it's open to you if you've got $500,000. You hand over that cash, it's put into a project which generates at least 10 jobs in an underdeveloped part of the US, and you get your visa. No surprise, though, that there are complaints about the scheme. Critics say it is open to manipulation, and as such, reforms are currently underway. But advocates say it was a lifeline to the real estate market during the financial crisis, and importantly, is a concrete job-creating tool. Well, our next guest runs a fund which puts money from the EB-5 visa program to work. He is Burke Edwards, Chief Operating Officer at the Texas Growth Fund Regional Center. Burke, tell me first up, where do you get most of your interest coming from? Which parts of the world?
Mainly we're from the Middle East at this point. Historically, the program has obtained most of the investment money from China. I think behind China it was, Vietnam, South Korea. But recently, over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a lot more people from the Middle East.
Okay, and I mean, how positive has it been for your local economy? Obviously, we know the benefits for those who invest because they get their visa and they get to come to the United States. But what about the effect in the United States on your real estate market, for example, which has had a very rough few years, hasn't it?
Well, we had a financial crisis in the United States in 07 and 08, where traditional sources of capital dried up for developers, and so they had to look elsewhere. One of the places they looked is to the EB-5 program and the immigrant investor dollar being deployed into their real estate projects. And so it has definitely been a big assist to real estate development in the United States over the last 8 years. More so than ever before, because traditional financing after the financial crisis made money hard to get, hard to borrow in the United States, and so this was a good avenue for developers.
Okay, so I'm seeing the positives of it so far, and I would expect you to tell me about all those things. There must be challenges, though. I simply wonder about the idea of maybe not quite manipulation, but the idea that it's people with a lot of money who can come in and make this happen for themselves, and there might be a backlash to that.
Well, let's just say anytime you're dealing with a government entity, there's going to be pitfalls and delays. And with the increase in the popularity of the program in the last 2 or 3 years, especially, there has been delays in paperwork being processed by USCIS, and the path to citizenship is taking longer than we think it should. There is talk of reform that's going to make the process more efficient, and I for one welcome these reforms so that the system is more efficient for getting the immigrant investor dollar deployed and potential citizenship.
Yeah, but that idea of citizenship in the first place, that idea of being able to buy citizenship, is that problematic? Maybe I'm thinking of this too much through, the prism of Europe at the moment, where immigration is such a sensitive issue. But you know as well as I do, US citizenship is a very valuable thing.
Right. Well, keep in mind that it's restricted where you can spend this money. I mean, the whole concept is creating jobs in the United States in areas, specific regional areas that otherwise wouldn't have projects like these. So it's designed for rural areas or projects that need job creation, for those projects to be built in those specific areas. And so it's a complicated process. It's not something that just you write a check for $500,000 and you get a visa. It's much more complicated than that. The job creation component has to be strictly documented and verified subsequent to the construction. Third-party economists go back and verify to the government that we did in fact create 10 jobs for every 500,000. And those jobs have to be verified in order for the immigrant investor to end up with a permanent visa. So it's not as simple as writing a check, that's for sure.
Right, okay. Just finally, you said, well, I know this has been traditionally built on Chinese money. You've sent that a lot of Middle Eastern money has been coming into the program now. Do you go anywhere else? Do you actually target certain places in the world and say, right, we need to bring these places into the fold?
Well, one of the things that's happened is the Chinese marketplace, if you will, for our industry has become saturated. And so in order to get a visa approved for a Chinese person, it takes longer than it would for Vietnamese, for Qatar, for Egypt, for UAE. The other countries that are non-Chinese have their applications get through the system quicker. And so almost all regional centers are looking outside of China now. I specifically like the Middle East because I think that there are wealthy enough citizens in many of those countries that want a better life for their families and education for their children and a better lifestyle. There's definitely political instability in that area, and everybody knows that the migrant factor from that part of the world is huge. This is one of the more interesting ways for those that have the means to get to the United States and obtain citizenship.
Burke Edwards, very interesting talking to you and learning about the system. Thanks so much for your time. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, banning the big bucks, or euros in this case. The 500 euro note is under threat because of its alleged links to gangsters and the criminal underworld. We're going to head round the rest of the world in this half of the show, starting in Brazil. Now, yes, it's carnival time. It's the biggest party. It's the most famous of Brazilian holidays. But does it have the same lure in the times of a failing economy, a political crisis, and a health emergency? Lucia Newman reports from Rio de Janeiro.
Carnival in Brazil. A time for samba and good humor as the nation struggles through an economic and political crisis. But not everyone is forgetting their problems. Like Niva Silva, who came dressed as a box of basic foods and goods used to measure the cost of living.
Buying the basics has become so expensive. Inflation is high and so is corruption, so the poor are suffering.
Indeed, this street party is loosely titled, "What a Mess, the Good Times Are Over." An opportunity for revelers to make fun of their ruling class.
The wife of the President of Congress is accused of hiring a tennis champion for $59,000 for private lessons with our money, so we're dressed up as her.
At another street parade, we run into President Dilma Rousseff and former President Lula da Silva, both being mercilessly mocked.
I'm a billionaire, but I have no idea where I got the money.
Men and women of Brazil, just to let you know, your light bill is going up 60%.
Brazil is facing a steep recession, and the president is fighting to avoid an impeachment process. This as Brazilians see their standard of living drop.
They are now going back to where they were 10 years ago because of the rising of unemployment, because of the rise of inflation, and so that's what's happening. Brazil is going to be where it was 10 years ago.
Even Carnival is being downsized.
Here at the Sambadrome, as you can see, no expenses being spared for Carnival. But in other parts of the city and the country, many traditional street parades are having to be cancelled because for the first time, they can't afford it.
Brazilians say the year doesn't begin until after Carnival. But regardless of when they start counting, it's a year that doesn't bode well for their economy.
No, and another factor in Brazil is the low oil price, and really this is something hitting a lot of countries. Russia, a non-OPEC producer but obviously a big player, is bracing for even harder times ahead because, as we know, its economy is hugely dependent on oil. Rory Challens has more from Moscow on how the Kremlin is feeling the pinch.
Russia's great wealth, also its great vulnerability. The country's fortunes are so bound to black gold that the Russian ruble rises and falls with the price of oil.
65% in the total export revenues of Russia are coming from fuel, and around 50% of the federal budget revenues are generated by the fuel sector. And this explains why, of course, the volatility of oil prices has the serious impact on ruble exchange rates.
Ordinary Russians are bearing the brunt of the slide. Prices have shot up. A recession is biting into wages. Living standards have fallen significantly for the first time in the Putin era. A protest blocked streets near the central bank. In boom times, these Russians took mortgages denominated in foreign currency. Now their repayments are unaffordable. But generally, public unrest has been conspicuous by its absence. For the moment, most people believe Russia's woes result from external shocks, not years of delayed reform. The government's problems are mounting. 2016's budget deficit must be no greater than 3%, says Vladimir Putin. Now, when oil was at $50 a barrel, that was just about possible. But if oil averages $40 a barrel for the year, then there'll be a 5% budget deficit. And if oil stays where it is now, roughly $30 a barrel, then Russia is looking at a 7% budget deficit. So how to fill the hole? Well, there's no catch-all solution. Imminent spending cuts will help a bit, as will a planned bond sale and a hike in oil export taxes. And a scheme from 2008 to sell off state companies like Aeroflot and Rosneft is back on the agenda. But many analysts doubt the privatisation drive will be any more successful this time.
The state's been saying for years, and I think everybody at the top realises that the government has to get out of business. It's a bad manager of business. The trouble is that the investment climate, given both the economic crisis here in Russia, the poor corporate governance, all those kind of issues, and on top of that, the tension with the West and the sanctions, the prospects of them selling anything is, if you ask me, next to zero.
Russia does have an immediate lifeline. 2 rainy day funds full enough to cover even a 5% deficit. But drain those now and there'll be little left to turn to in 2017 if oil prices stay low.
And that pinch in Russia spreads into the rest of Europe as well. Finland is an interesting example. Its exports to Russia fell 34% in value last year, according to new figures. And unfortunately, as I discussed with the finance minister Alexander Stubb in Davos a few weeks ago, it's part of a wider malaise in Finland. Its economy actually hasn't grown in 5 years. Jonah Hull brings us more from Oulu in Finland.
Finland could hardly have less in common with the countries of sunny southern Europe. Yet in its 4th year of recession, the once prosperous, most northern member of the EU joins Greece at the bottom of the economic league table.
We have failed to do necessary reforms, and things are getting worse at the time in Finland when things are getting better in other European sort of crisis countries.
Harry is a craft beer brewer, part of a generation of start-up entrepreneurs who once worked for the now defunct mobile phone giant Nokia.
I would say that it was way too much Nokia focused, at least the business environment back in that time. Now we have, of course, several small companies here. We have several quite a big companies that have established their offices here in Oulu.
Harry brews his beer in the northern city of Oulu.
Pretty strong.
Nokia's former heartland. The boom years brought big salaries. Now Finland's high-wage workforce is too expensive to compete globally.
Well, the story of Nokia's decline is pretty simple, really. Once the world's dominant mobile phone handset manufacturer, remember these, employing 24,000 people here in Finland and worth $320 billion, a huge chunk of the national economy. Well, then came Apple's iPhone. Nokia failed to innovate, to stay in the game, and the whole business was swept away, leaving only remnants involved in networks behind.
Dark days too for Finland's other mainstay, the paper industry, in decline because of cheaper pulp and cheaper workers elsewhere. And the soup kitchens are filling up. It's no better in the capital Helsinki. 10 years ago, this food bank served 200 people a day. Now the cold and hungry arrive twice a week in their thousands.
Here it's not much people, but there's other line, people getting food, and it's very long line, and it's getting more and more. We were 2 years ago first time, and now like this year it's getting like double the size.
The government's preferred solution is austerity, and amid the spending cuts there's pressure to return to a sovereign currency so that Finland can devalue its way out of economic trouble. No Greek-style bailout then, but a new euro crisis, maybe.
But just before we go, a mini crisis for the euro. The EU has been urged to shred the 500 euro note because of its links to drugs trafficking and the black market. Now, British banks stopped supplying the pink and purple notes back in 2010. And now the EU's anti-fraud chief is calling for it to be done away with. Apparently, 500 in one note is just too big. It makes it easy for drugs lords, tax evaders and terrorists to move larger sums without detection. We should point out, though, getting rid of it doesn't solve the problem. Over in Switzerland, there's a 1,000 Swiss franc note, which is worth around 910 euros. And on that note, that is our show for this week. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page. It has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us. You can tweet me at KamalAJE. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.